The Liar Princess and the Blind Prince is probably the closest I've ever seen a game get to actually feeling like I'm playing through a Grimm fairy tale. The story is easily this game's high point, a tragic romance that unfurls in classic fairy tale style, following a wolf who transforms into a human and pretends to be a princess, and the blind prince who literally can't see through her deception. It's like The Little Mermaid, except everything is awful and nobody is happy, ever. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're off to see the witch in The Liar Princess and the Blind Prince. There are a lot of things this game does really well. It's got this art style that almost looks like a Japanified version of Where the Wild Things Are, a solid orchestral score, and a pretty dang good story. But a lot of the things that Liar Princess does really well are also things that aren't, to borrow a phrase from myself, everybody's jam. For example, it's got a pretty dang good story, but it's also an overwhelmingly depressing one, and perpetual doom and gloom isn't necessarily to everyone's taste. The Liar Princess and the Blind Prince starts with a deeply human and tragic encounter. The setup is that there's this wolf that sings a beautiful song out in the woods, and a prince that shows up to listen every night. But eventually, the prince decides to actually try and meet the source of the singing, and by startling the wolf, earns himself a claw to the face that renders him blind. And from there, things just slowly go from bad to worse as desperate bargains are made and deceptions are layered atop deceptions, as the wolf poses as a princess and tries to fix her mistake by bringing the prince to a witch to fix his injury, without cluing him into the fact that she's the one that mauled him in the first place. This is a quest already set up to fail before it's even begun. And as it goes on, Liar Princess always uses the sharpest knife possible on its characters to make things worse. And it's sharply written, because every time a moment is soured or something goes wrong, it's entirely the fault of the two main characters, their personalities, and their flawed perceptions of each other. These characters are so tightly written and well presented to the audience that the moment you step into a given scene, you can already see the worst possible way someone's going to screw it up. But just like when you can already see a car crash in the making half a block before it happens and are powerless to stop it, seeing exactly how an otherwise happy moment will be twisted into a bittersweet or tragic event only raises the tension as a scene draws on. Liar Princess's story does have its light moments, but overwhelmingly, this tension, the promise that this too is inevitably going to go wrong somehow, is what draws the action forward. Liar Princess also made some bold choices on how to deliver that story, primarily using cutscenes with a single narrator voicing every character's dialogue as well as any physical actions they make. And these scenes are predominantly text-based, with only the visuals being a series of admittedly beautiful but static still frames. And as this was a game originally made in Japan, that means the narration is entirely in Japanese, which leads to 15 to 30 minute cutscenes where you're just sitting there reading text like it's a visual novel. And I've seen enough MGS memes to know that's a deal breaker for some people, but these stylistic choices also make it feel like you're sitting at a campfire getting told this ancient story that's been orally passed down through the ages. And that's the primary reason for that grim fairy tale feeling I mentioned at the beginning. That said, these cutscenes are the game's high point not just because they're well executed, but also because the game's other main element, its gameplay, is the low point by comparison. To be clear, Liar Princess's gameplay, which is mostly a puzzle game with some extremely light combat and platforming elements, is at most times competently executed. And the game certainly doesn't lack variety in its obstacles either. It's just that all these systems are so dirt simple and uninteresting to engage with. The core of the gameplay revolves around controlling the princess's two forms. Your objective is to get the prince from one side of the map to the other, but you can only escort him as a human. But your human form is frail and weak, and so when you have to fight off monsters or reach a faraway ledge, you have to leave the prince behind and transform back into a wolf. And almost all the challenges in the game revolve around you having to balance the priorities of each form, keeping the prince safe while you escort him along. To be fair to Liar Princess, its mechanics get a ton of points for being thematic and reinforcing the game's story beats. And for being what's effectively an escort mission strung out to be an entire game, Liar Princess is shockingly devoid of the frustration that naturally comes with the territory. But that's in large part thanks to a generous checkpoint system and an extremely low difficulty curve. Combat mostly just revolves around mashing one button 2 or 3 times until the bad thing dies. Platforming never gets much more interesting than using these mushrooms as jump pads to jump higher, and most puzzles are usually a variation on figuring out what button to leave the princess a paperweight on. Mechanically, Liar Princess is at its most interesting when it starts introducing commands so you can give the prince from afar, which leads to scenarios where you have to verbally guide him across the map while simultaneously doing something else to make sure he gets there safely. These moments finally deliver on Liar Princess's multitasking promise, but they mostly don't come until late into the game. It clearly displays what the game could be, but aside from these points, you deal with each of Liar Princess's mechanical systems one at a time, and when dealt with singly, no individual mechanical system holds up all on its own. And here again, this is why Liar Princess isn't necessarily for everyone. You have gameplay that isn't particularly mechanically engaging, but is heavily intertwined with the game's narrative, and depending on what you look for in a video game, this is either going to sound miserable or straight up your alley. But let's try to bring this all together and ask, what do you get out of 5 hours with the Liar Princess and the Blind Prince? That's enough to finish the game and see the credits. If you actually find yourself enjoying the gameplay, there are a few collectibles you can go back for afterwards, but once you've seen the story, I think you can safely put this one up on the shelf. As for a recommendation on whether to get it or not, that one's a lot tougher. I personally enjoyed it and thought that it was worth the time spent, and I think if you're looking for a unique experience, this one's different in tone and approach compared to most games. But like I've tried to illustrate, your mileage is going to vary depending on your personal tastes and how those overlap with almost every design decision in this game. I know that's true to a point with literally any game, and maybe that's not the most helpful recommendation, but I think it rings even truer here than with others. The Liar Princess and the Blind Prince is definitely not for everyone, but for the people it is for, there's a lot to appreciate here. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that first 5 review. If you did, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. If you're looking for games that value your time and don't pad themselves, I'm your guy. And be sure to check out some of my other reviews or some longer form content while you're here. But regardless, thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.